inspiration to a lot of people, and he's always been uncompromising when it comes to God's truth. I've got a lot of respect for him, even as my younger brother. Yeah, but he's always been there for me, and I think you're going to really enjoy what he has to teach us today.
Well, I appreciate that very nice introduction there. Typically, I think you've used the term as hellraiser when you referring to me, but uncompromising, that sounds a lot better. I like that. But I do really appreciate this opportunity to be able to speak to everyone today. I currently, although I grew up in the Treasure Valley, I currently live in Texas and known Weston and Lavina for my entire life and the Higgins family. It was actually Wes who signed me and Byron up for Speech Club when we were about 14, 15 years old. And by the term of sign up, I really mean he drafted us. It was one of those show up or else type situations. So Byron and I both began speaking at a very young age. As you realize, I am unfortunately related to Byron. And I did want to publicly congratulate him on his recent ordination. I'm very proud and honored that somebody in the family did something amazing like that. However, it finally came to my realization, apparently the General Council of Elders didn't consider his driving record when they ordained him. Because, you know, Byron's probably wrecked more vehicles than most of us have driven in our life. So I know we all grow in grace and driving skills at different rates, but when a couple of those vehicles belong to you, it might be a little bit of a sore spot, and you might use a venue like this to get a little retribution. So that's where we are now, retribution. But all kidding aside, I do appreciate my brother's recommendation for this and the opportunity to share a little bit of what God has inspired me. I hope you can find it informative as well as inspiring. I hope to give this message in person, but my schedule was crazy. I put like 5,000 miles on in like the last 5 days. So I just got off the road. It's a long story, but put a lot of miles on recently and wasn't able to make it. In 2020, my son Noah had graduated from high school, and he signed up for classes at our local college, at Sierra College in Roseville, which was our local community college. And he was selecting his classes, and he had room for an elective in humanities. And I suggested he take a comparative religion class that they were offering. I'd taken one earlier and found it to be very invaluable. It's very eye-opening, and it makes you really appreciate the Word of God to a degree that you never have before. When you begin to compare Christianity and the Holy Scriptures to other religions and other religious writings, and not until then you finally realize how no other religious systems even closely compare to the explanation on our purpose in life, why we were put on this earth, what defines morality. Nothing comes close. The sacrifices of, especially of our Savior, who gave himself for mankind, all of mankind, there's nothing that compares in any of these other religions. So I suggested that he take this class. Well, due to the never-ending lockdowns in California that went on forever and ever, he had to take all of his classes online. And at the time, I was remodeling my house, getting ready to sell it. And so I got the opportunity to listen to his class. Well, by the time I'd gotten partway through this comparative religion class, I realized, well, it isn't really a comparative religion class. It's more of an Eastern religion appreciation class and a very critical Christian and Jewish class. The professor there took every opportunity to try and elevate and find the spiritual significance in every bizarre and crazy religious practice out there. And at the same time, he took every perceivable cheap shot to take at the Bible and Christianity to try and discredit. And unfortunately, I was sitting right there at the time next to him, so I was able to run interference and show all these situations where the guy's just straight up lying. but there's no telling what damage this saboteur of faith might have done if I wasn't there. And there's no telling what damage he did to other students whose parents weren't there in the room with him, listening in. One of his very dishonest cheap shots was based on Numbers chapter 12 and verse 13. That's the right slide. Nope. Give me a second. I'm getting this thing worked out. Okay. Numbers chapter 12 and verse 13. It says, the man Moses was very humble, more than all men were on the face of the earth. Now, the professor here, he made a very astute observation, right? He says, well, if Moses wrote this section of scripture, it's ridiculous that a humble man would brag about being humble, right? And he went on to explain this is a perfect example of how ridiculous the Bible is. Well, this was a very intellectually dishonest statement that he was making for several reasons. See, Jewish rabbis, elders, traditional Bible scholars have had an explanation for this passage for centuries, even thousands of years ago, attributing it in a slew of other editorial updates to Ezra the priest in conjunction with a contemporary prophet who was responsible not only for canonizing the New Testament, but updating a lot of the words, name places, phrases, making clarifications. You realize there's a 1,000 years that have transpired since the time of Moses to the time of Ezra, and they made some updates. And they also put some explanations in there. And there's a bunch of examples of this, like in Genesis chapter 14 and verse 14, Abraham here chases these kings as far as Dan. Now, the writer of the book of Genesis wasn't stupid enough to think that Abraham knew where Dan's future territory would be. Dan wasn't even born. They hadn't even entered into the promised land. This was an example of an editorial update that was made by Ezra. The whatever the name was there, no one knew what it meant and where it was at, and so Ezra updated. Another great example is over in Deuteronomy 34, where it talks about Joshua the son of Nun, full of wisdom. Here he is, he's taking the place of Moses, and the children of Israel heeded him like they did Moses. And then it says, but since then there has not arisen a prophet like Moses whom the Lord knew face to face. Now, apparently Joshua is a very impatient individual. This guy Moses, he's been dead for a good 15 minutes, and this prophet, like unto Moses, hasn't showed up yet. Where's he at? Right? Ridiculous, right? This is one of those passages that was written by Ezra as an editorial update, and making it clear that it's now been 1,000 years since the time of Moses, and this prophet, like unto Moses, hasn't shown up yet. And Ezra here is making it clear that these prophecies hasn't been filled. The story of the Bible is not yet completed. And so for this professor, and there's numerous other cheap shots they take, to talk about Moses being the most humble man being an oxymoron is very dishonest at best, or he's extremely ignorant. First of all, he's implying that there isn't any other explanation to this passage. He can say most scholars find this to be an oxymoron, but to try and have us believe that traditional Christian scholars and traditional Jewish scholars and rabbis have had no response to this is a lie. And in reality, we have a very logical response, and we've had a response for it for thousands of years. And there's plenty of these grossly deceptive tactics that have been used over and over again by academia. And these types of deceptive tactics, they're being used against our young adults and teens on a daily basis. And so for the remainder of the time today, I would like to show how these grossly deceptive tactics that are being used in our universities and colleges of higher education, they've actually absolutely infested these education systems. And unless we fully prepare our children and young adults and teens and warn them of these deceptive tactics before they head off to college, they can very well have their faith crushed by these lies. When they head out to these universities and even the workplace, they will be bombarded by these lies. And as we are told to not be ignorant of Satan's devices, we must know and warn our young adults ahead of time of these lies and tactics before they're blindsided by them. Let's turn over real quick to Romans chapter 1 in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what is may be known of God is manifest in them. So these college and universities, they know this stuff. They have the access to this information. We're not talking about the greater plan of God or even Christianity, but by simple observations, whether we're talking about, geology or microbiology or just the creation around them, there is a certain level of God that has been manifest to them. It has been shown to them, and they utterly reject it. And you can see in their lives, there is a definite bias. There is an agenda to try and deny what truth there is God that should be manifest to everyone. And we're going to go through some of these. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made. The nature of God, to a degree, as creation power, should be understood, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. These men are without excuse. They should know better. The knowledge of God, just from the observable creation, should be enough for them to have some level of knowledge of God. Because although they knew God, they would not glorify him, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. And that is where we're at. Academia and these institutions of higher education have willfully rejected this knowledge, and they take every opportunity to lie about God whenever they get a chance. And there's 4 basic myths about academia that many of us believe. I admit I believe some of these myths. It took a while for me to finally realize that. I knew to a degree that there was some shady stuff going on, but the full reality did not come until I did a bunch of research. The first myth that many of us, including me, believe is that a Bible scholar, a biblical archaeologist, a theologian, a biblical linguist who's spent his entire life studying the scriptures, studying biblical archaeology, studying the biblical text as a linguist, must, obviously believe to one degree or another in God, to some degree, or he wouldn't have spent his entire life studying it. Well, that is absolutely not the case necessarily. As counterintuitive as it might sound, there are individuals out there who have spent their entire lives studying the Word of God and don't believe any of it. There's individuals out there who drove a Ford pickup truck their entire life. They work at the Ford assembly plant. They have a tattoo of Henry Ford on their back and yet hate the Ford Motor Company, right? As crazy it might sound, it's true. And there are theologians, Bible scholars, biblical archaeologists, Bible translators who spent their entire careers studying the Bible, and at the same time they hate God and everything about Christianity. A good example of this is Westcott and Hort. Both Westcott and Hort were, kick on over here. Both Westcott and Hort were known for producing the lexicon, the New Testament in Greek, from which we get the Revised Standard Version, the later English Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, which are all based on these superfluous manuscripts. And both of these guys spent their entire lives studying these Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and were successful in getting the Church of England and many others to abandon the received text in favor of these older private copies. They believed the Bible was full of corruptions and numerous errors, and these private manuscripts, although full of errors, were better than the King James Version, right? Because those were newer manuscripts. But later on, due to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was discovered, in fact, that they were completely wrong, that the Bible is incredibly accurate. But not only that, these guys, Westcott and Hort, they were heavily involved in the occult. They practiced seances, they were channeling spirits, they were doing all kinds of weird stuff. And so we shouldn't think it's strange and bizarre that someone could spend their entire lives studying a book that they don't believe in any of them. The second myth that I'd like to shatter during this presentation is the illusion of consensus. And many in academia use this illusion of consensus to their advantage. We have a belief that if all the experts, all the scientists, all the scholars in unison believe that humans are bred from monkeys, the vaccine's safe and effective, the book of Daniel was written 400 years after the fact, whatever it might be, if all of them repeat it in unison, well, it must be true, at least to some degree, right? There must be some, at least at a minimum, some level of intellectual honesty if all of them are saying it at the same time. Well, once again, that is absolutely not the case. And we're going to see a lot of examples of this, of how they force each other to come together with a common, narrative that's all pre-planned. There's motive involved. They have an agenda, and a consensus does not mean that they all agree. A third myth is that because the scientific method, because science has accomplished so much in the last couple hundred years. We've eradicated disease, we've sent men to the moon, we've built mass transportation systems and communication systems, we've extended our life expectancies. Because we've accomplished so much with science and the scientific method, that there's a certain level of respect, and that this scientific method has become sacred to these scientists, to the biologists and medical professionals. They would never violate the method because it is their only mechanism for obtaining the truth, right? Well, that is absolutely not the truth. They have no regard for science. They have no regard for God. They will violate the scientific method in a New York minute to push their agenda, and especially if it can discredit the Bible and attack God. And I'm going to show multiple examples of that. A fourth myth that I hopefully will be able to destroy is that professionals, and really any individual for that matter, that they can successfully compartmentalize their personal morality from their professional career. That in their personal life, they can, cheat on their wife, kick their dog, steal their neighbor's newspapers, wreck their brother's truck. Just had to throw that in, sorry. That someone's personal life can be a total moral train wreck, right? But when they show up to the job site or they show up to the office, they're going to conduct themselves in a completely ethical manner and completely responsible manner. They're going to do their work and work hard and be unbiased. Well, that's absolutely not true. Quite often, when their personal life is a moral train wreck, they also have a lot of animosity towards Christianity because it's one of the few religions out there that require them to examine themselves, and which they refuse to do so. And there's a lot of examples of this. For instance, in the 1920s in the Samoan Islands was one of the few places on the globe where they were relatively insulated from Western culture and the outside world. And a young anthropologist in 1925 traveled to these remote Samoan islands in the South Pacific to visit them and study the people. And as an anthropologist, this would be the place to go to study a different culture. And according to Mead, the Samoan people were so unshackled by the traditions of our Western culture and society. Supposedly, they all had open relationships, and nobody thought anything about it. And the normal jealousies, the feelings of betrayal that we normally have when we're dealing with unfaithfulness, like the normal feelings of betrayal, heartbreak, anger that normally accompany unfaithfulness in America. Well, none of these emotions existed in Samoa because open relationships were so normal. And the problems as a society that we have with adultery isn't because there's anything inherently wrong with the act itself. It's only our reaction to it. Listen to this quote from Margaret Mead in her book, Coming of Age. Having many mistresses is never out of harmony with a declaration of affection for each other. Romantic love, as it occurs in our society, inextricably bound up with ideas of monogamy, exclusiveness, jealousy, and undeviating fidelity, does not occur in Samoa. Adultery does not necessarily mean a broken marriage. Divorce is a simple informal matter. Many adulteries occur, which hardly threaten the continuity of established relationships. And so there are no marriages of any duration in which either person is actively unhappy. And Margaret Mead, she painted this fanciful picture of this place where people were untainted by the harsh rules and stigmatisms of our Christian society. They all had open marriages, multiple partners, and yet there were no consequences for infidelity, illegitimate children, broken commitments, none of that existed. And somehow loyalty meant nothing, faithfulness was irrelevant, commitment was a joke, right? And yet their society was very stable and peaceful at the same time. Now, to an intellectual, this seems completely plausible. And since she wrote it up and submitted it in a scientific format, it had to be true, right? But to anyone with a little common sense, an episode of Scooby-Doo is probably more plausible, right? But academia ate it up. She received multiple appointments. She received widespread acclaim and praise in the universities throughout America. She received dozens of speaking requests. She received numerous appointments of president and vice president in various academic associations like the New York Academy of Science, the American Anthropological Association. She was a keynote speaker at numerous conventions, interviewed hundreds of times, quoted thousands. Her book, Coming of Age, sold millions of copies. And her impact on higher education was a major contributor to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Well, shortly after Mead visited the island, another anthropologist, Derek Friedman, did as well. And unlike Mead, he knew the language. He spent several years there on the island. I'm trying to get this to go up here real quick. He didn't need a translator. He interviewed a wide range of people, including tribal elders and leaders, not just teenagers like Mead had done. He also was on the island for over 4 months, where Mead was just there for a couple of weeks. And he got completely different results. Not only did he find out that the Samoan children actually did want to know who their parents were, and the parents wanted to know who their children were, that the people, even on these remote islands, did appreciate loyalty, faithfulness, commitments, integrity. They also had the exact same reports of domestic violence and stabbings and murders when the husband comes home and finds his wife in bed with another man. Who'd have thunk it? Margaret Mead's work was a complete fraud. But not only that, it was found out that Mead was actually having an affair at the same time she was doing her research. See, she was simply trying to justify what she was doing. She's trying to clear a guilty conscience. And apparently there's a lot of people in academia that have the same guilty conscience because of how universally widespread her work was accepted, despite how ridiculous her claims were. There's a passage in Proverbs, in Judges, it's in the many places throughout scriptures, where it says, every way of a man seems right in his own eyes. Man has this inherent desire to feel right about what we're already doing. We have a conscience we have to live with. We have to sleep at night. We have to look at ourselves in the mirror. We have to feel right about what we're doing. Every way of a man seems right in his own eyes. But when we do fall short, we come to a crossroads and we basically have a couple options. We can acknowledge our sin, acknowledge our mistakes, tell ourselves this is unacceptable, this is wrong, or we can justify ourselves, make excuses, tell ourselves this is somebody else's fault. I did nothing wrong. This is normal. This is actually pretty scientific. The Samoan people are doing it, right? Well, that's consistently what academia does. A lot of what they do is based on justifying their sins through academics and justifying their attacks on God through academics. In 1936, a prominent and well-respected archaeologist by the name of John Garstein, who had headed dozens and dozens of digs throughout the Near East, began to excavate the ancient city of Jericho. And he made some amazing discoveries. His findings seemed to overwhelmingly support the biblical account of the conquest of Jericho by Joshua. He'd found that the walls of the city had fallen outwards due to a huge earthquake, forming a ramp so the invaders could quickly enter into the city as indicated. He'd found that the city was burnt to the ground and all the supplies were left behind, which is very odd. Usually the victor receives all the spoils, and why they would burn all the supplies makes not a lot of sense. Also, there were parts of the poor part of town that were spared from the earthquake, because when they were there in the corner and the walls fell outward, if you were right there in that void spot, you were spared. And that is a very plausible location where Rahab could have lived. But not only that, due to the pottery and other perishable items that were found there, he dated the destruction of Jericho to the early 15th, late 14th century BC, which is exactly when the Bible indicates. Well, shortly after his excavation in 1936, World War II had broken out in 1942. And by 1948, there was war again in Palestine, Israel's war for independence, also known as the Arab-Israeli War. Well, as Israel was trying to get recognized as an independent state, part of their legitimacy came from the fact that God had given this land to them and they had conquered it under his direction. And the archaeological evidence that John Garstein had done 10 years earlier had validated this. Well, academia in London and Oxford was very pro-Palestinian, and they are to this day, and they weren't going to stand for this. So they sent Kathleen Kenyon, the daughter of Frederick Kenyon, to re-excavate Jericho. Frederick Kenyon was a very critical Bible scholar. Their family had been involved in academia for generations. And he'd written considerably about how the Hebrew text and the Masoretic text had been corrupted. So he was definitely a Bible minimalist. And so his daughter was the perfect person for the job. And what do you know? She came up with completely different results. Not only did she find no evidence that Joshua's conquest had taken place, but she determined that the city had been uninhabited for over 100 years before the Israelites had even arrived. Not only was this the first dig that she had ever been involved in, but you would think that the fact that Kathleen Kenyon was a very active and vocal anti-Semite and anti-Zionist would, disqualify her as being too partial to lead this kind of excavation, right? You would think. Well, of course not, right? Even Bar Magazine thought it was a bit odd to put someone like this, who's a very vocal anti-Semite and anti-Zionist, in this kind of position, and they wrote several articles on it. One of this being a article dated in 1975, Kathleen Kenyon's anti-Zionist politics, does it affect her work? Right? Well, maybe if she was an auto mechanic that only worked on German cars, well, maybe not. But as a archaeologist leading an excavation designed to discredit the nation of Israel and discredit the Bible, well, absolutely. And can you see how many of these myths that I mentioned are quickly getting shattered? The scientific method is not sacred. They will violate it with impunity. A person's personal life directly affects their personal findings. You can't separate the two. And you're going to see as time goes on, the ideas that we have about our institutes of higher education are false. Many of these individuals are either charlatans or they're cowards. And so how did Kathleen Kenyon find no evidence to support the biblical narrative where Garstang found tons of evidence? Well, all of the artifacts and findings that supported the biblical narrative, she just dated to a different time period. And so it was irrelevant to Joshua's conquest. It was that simple. And this is a very common tactic that academia uses to ignore information they don't like. Sorry, we didn't find any information that we wanted to attribute to the biblical narrative. Kathleen Kenyon pushed the date of the destruction of Jericho to just 100 years past the traditional dating. And so any findings that seemed to support the Bible, she could just dismiss it all. And that's where it stood for 30 years. In 1990, Brian Woods investigated her work, and he showed conclusively that Kenyon was in error, and it should have been dated, as Garstang stated, in the 14th century BC. But once again, academia wasn't going to stand for this, so they decided that now carbon-14 dating was what needed to be used instead of all those other traditional forms, even though you can't hit the broadside of a barn with carbon-14 dating, but that's what we're going to use now. And that's the dating that they now use to support Kenyon's excavation is with carbon-14. And if you look at some of these calibration curves on here, they're all over the place. You can see that they're up and down and they're all over, and you can play with these calibration curves as much as you want. It's pretty much a joke, you know. But that's what they've done, so they don't have to attribute any of this information to the biblical narrative. And that's exactly what they've done in the Exodus account as well. There is overwhelming support to show and support the biblical account of the Exodus. Archaeologists just take all those findings and they date it to a different time period, so they don't have to attribute any of it to the Bible. Multiple digs in the Delta region have shown that the Semitic people lived in Egypt from the 17th century to the 15th century BC, right in that target area where we know the children of Israel lived in Goshen. And one example of this, and there's many examples, there's a great book which I left somewhere. Oh, here it is. Pharaohs and Kings is a great book. It goes through a bunch of this evidence. I'd recommend it. And they show how all this evidence that leads to the fact that there were Semitic people in Egypt during this period of time. And one of the examples we know as Joseph told his father Jacob that shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. They kept their animals, as you can see, directly outside their homes. Their houses doubled as a barn so they could keep track of their livestock at night. Well, the Egyptians kept their animals and their livestock far away from their houses. And so this is one of the many examples that there were Semitic people there as well. Also, Semitic people had a much different burial system. When, you know, the Egyptians were usually laying flat, they usually had embalming, they usually had possessions, whereas Semitic people typically had this very common fashion where they were buried in a kneeling position and facing the east, because the promised land was towards the east at the time. And so these are one of the many examples that we have to know there were Semitic people there. The other thing that they have found is that there is plenty of evidence to show that there were slaves being used in Egypt during the construction of these pyramids. And it's very easy to prove. When you have these large construction projects like pyramids, the sphinxes, whatever you're talking about, and you find these ditches, right next to the construction site, where you just dispose of people into these ditches as they're working, and they fall down and they can't do the job anymore, and they get thrown into these ditches. It's very clear to see that these were slaves that are being used for these constructions. We'll talk a little bit later about why the Israelites were complaining so much about not being in Egypt and eating those melons and leeches when they could have gotten thrown into the ditch, but that's another topic. But the point being is there's plenty of evidence to show that the Egyptians were using slave labor. Another reason we know that they were using slave labor in Egypt during the time of the building of all these monuments is from the Brooklyn Papyrus. The Brooklyn Papyrus dates to the 13th century Egyptian dynasty and easily fits once again within the time period that the children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt. And it's a record of all the slaves that a noblewoman who was the wife of the nation's vizier, that's very similar to a prime minister, she lists all of her 95 slaves. And 40 of the 95, almost half of them had Hebrew names. Most of those names are later shown in scripture. And so, and when you read this kind of stuff, and I think back to all these documentaries, and you've probably seen them too, where they from the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, unlocking the secrets of the pyramids, or how did the pharaohs build these monuments, some headliner grabber like that. And they're trying to come up with all these convoluted ways that they could have moved all these blocks, and did they have ancient technology? Well, it's all lies. There is so much evidence to show that they were using slave labor, and most likely most of that was Israelite slave labor. It's quite disgusting. But that's the situation we're living in. They don't want to believe the truth. They're looking for every opportunity to discredit the biblical account. Archaeologists have also found a rather large Semitic tomb and statue located in the Delta region, once again, around the area of Goshen, depicting the owner wearing a coat of many colors, and all of his bones were missing for some reason. And we know that he was a foreign ruler due to the type of scepter that he was holding there. You can see it in his hand right there with this crooked, and oh, sorry, that's not it. Right up there. That little bent on there refers to the fact that he was a foreign ruler, and the rest of the staff isn't there, but it should be a long scepter. And once again, you don't hear about any of this because they won't attribute any of this to the Exodus account because they give it a different dating. And it's really insane, their logic. They won't attribute, these minimalist Bible scholars don't agree with the traditional Bible dating, and yet they use that exact same dating system to exclude any information they don't agree with. And this is absolutely deceptive and dishonest. And that's what they're doing on a regular basis. I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation. The Pure Papyrus, I think is how you pronounce it, is an ancient Egyptian document, and it dates on or before the 12th dynasty BC. And it describes quite a number of the plagues of Egypt. And once again, it fits within that period of time of the Exodus. And as we know, the first plague of Exodus 7, verse 20 describes the Nile being turned into blood and the Egyptians not being able to consume the water required, and they can't drink it. And this is what the IPU papyrus says. The river is blood, men shrink from tasting it, human beings, and thirst after water. Probably cattle was in there. There's a couple pieces they couldn't make out. Also the fifth plague, where in Exodus 9, verse 3 records that God struck the livestock and all the animals of Egypt. This is what the IPU papyrus says. All of the animals in their hearts weep, cattle moan. Behold, cattle are left to stray. There's none to gather them in. The seventh plague, God describes it when he sent thunder, hail, and fire from the heavens to the ground. And this is what the IPU papyrus says. Forsooth gates, columns, and walls consumed by fire. The ninth plague, which we know covered the land of Egypt with darkness for 3 days. The IPU papyrus says the land is without light. And it was also during the same time period, once again, archaeologists found these plague pits. And the reason they know that these are plague pits is there were locations where mass burials took place. And as we know, the Egyptians were very meticulous about their burying rituals. And most people in the Near East had certain burial rituals. Well, when you have these mass burials and nobody's being embalmed, nobody's taking their relics or their important spiritual tokens with them to the grave, and they're all just thrown in this pit, and there's no swords stuck into them, there's no arms whacked off, there's nothing like that. They're all intact. It's a very easy, it doesn't take a rocket surgeon to realize that there was some plague that came through here, and that's what they found. They found these mass plague pits that fit the exact time of when the Exodus account took place. And once again, no modern scholar, archaeologist, Egyptologist, historian will attribute any of this, the Exodus count, because they give it a different timeline. And they want to date it at a different time, and so they don't have to attribute any of it. And it's completely dishonest. And as we continue to look at these different examples, we need to remember and hope that we're educating our young people, our young adults, and our teens to realize how incredibly dishonest these individuals in higher education are. The research scientists, we're talking about biologists or evolutionary scientists, if it has anything to do with the Bible or God, they will find a way to spin it every time. And another important area to address is our online sources, especially Wikipedia and now AI. Many of us know that Wikipedia is an online resource. It's an online resource where anybody can contribute. And so it was designed to be this culmination of human knowledge that everyone could go in and chat and figure out their ideas and contribute to these different articles. Well, the problem is that all of the information in there is based on who has the most time to defend it. And so if, for instance, like me, I've tried to contribute multiple times and you finally give up. It's an uphill battle that you're never going to win. You can go in there at 2 a.m. in the morning, contribute a little section to the article that you're studying, and by 2:30 a.m. it's been pulled down and they put something else in place of it. And so unless you've got no life, no kids, no job, no nothing, and can just sit there and monitor this one article, you're never going to win, because there's a 100-to-1 ratio of people that have this atheistic viewpoint and want to attack and destroy anything that has to do with Christianity. And there's numerous examples on this. One time I was contributing to a section, and it was on the Jericho dig. and they had a section for the traditional dating, and the majority of the article was the new dating system that they had. And so I'm just wanting to contribute to this very small portion at the bottom that talks about the traditional dating system. Even there, they wouldn't let me contribute to it. There was always some other guy that went in there and removed it. And so once again, Wikipedia is based on the person who only has the most time to defend it. And it's usually somebody who has an agenda to want to hate God. For instance, over 100 years before developed archaeology, academia and Bible critics regularly attacked the biblical accounts of the Hittite people as simply being mythological because they had no Greek or Roman historians to confirm that they existed. And basically their approach has always been, if you can't find an outside source to confirm the Bible, then the biblical accounts are just Hebrew folklore and legend, campfire stories, right? Well, when archaeologists found clay tablets in the late 19th century referring to the king of the Hittites, and the capital city of Hasifa in modern day Turkey, they realized that the Bible was correct. The Hittites did exist. But then this was simply dismissed by Bible critics because, well, it's not nearly as formidable as the Bible described. And it might have been one small little settlement, but nothing like what the Bible described. Well, by the early 20th century, when more and more digs were discovered, they uncovered the entire city of Hasifa in Turkey, as well as other settlements. They realized that, in fact, the Bible was as formidable, the Hittite Empire was as formidable as the Bible had indicated. But Bible minimalists simply dismissed this information again by simply saying, well, it's really too soon to make any connection to the Hittites of the Bible. One of these individuals was John Skinner, professor and principal at Cambridge College. And he basically stated there was no evidence that you could connect the Hittites of the Bible to these findings of the Hittite Empire. And you're thinking to yourself, really? Here you've got this empire of the right size, of the same name, living in the same geographical area, ruling during the same time period as the Bible describes it. And you're saying we still can't know if this is the same Hittites of the Bible? Well, even after archaeologists dug up and translated even more clay tablets, and they began to closely examine the customs of the Hittites, and they found that they closely matched the customs of the Hittites as described in the Bible. The transactions that Abraham had with the sons of Heth, Uriah the Hittite, where he slept on the ground and he wouldn't go into his wife, and he had this warrior code. Well, that's all Hittite culture and customs. And I could do a whole, message on how the customs of the Hittites perfectly match the customs of the Hittites as described in Scripture. But if you look up the Hittites to this day on Wikipedia, this is what you're going to find. It is a matter of considerable scholarly debate whether the biblical Hittites, as described, represent any of the groups associated with the Hittites. And so once again, they're never going to concede, they're never going to agree with traditional biblical views. They're only trying to minimize and remove the authority of the Scripture any chance they get. And basically Wikipedia has become a encyclopedia for atheists, and that's pretty much it. Another area that I would like to talk about is AI, artificial intelligence, and platforms like ChatGPT. And they're basically a language modeler. I've used them many times in the past. If you're wanting to do any online research that has nothing to do with the Scriptures, Bible, or politics, well, then it's pretty cool. It will search the internet for you and find information, and you can chat to it like you would any person. And so a lot of times when you're searching for stuff online and you have to do keyword searches or search for a certain specific period of time, it's so much quicker because you can ask this computer questions just like you would ask anybody else. But unfortunately, AI has been pre-programmed to be woke and push the agenda of academia. And there's been several articles by several conservative news outlets that have talked about this, that there is a definite left-wing bias within these AI chat engines to be liberal. And I've seen that they've consistently left out information that might confirm the Bible and consistently points you towards other critical Bible scholars and commentaries. The other day when I was doing some research, I asked it what information did it have on Ezra having finished the canon of the Old Testament. Okay, that's what I asked. Well, immediately it began to lecture me on the documentary hypothesis and other theories by critical Bible scholars. And I told it, I don't believe in the documentary hypothesis or any of this minimalistic garbage, okay? I asked you, can you give me sources that talk about Ezra completing the canon of the Hebrew scriptures? And what he tells me is, oh, sorry, I don't have any knowledge of that. There's no direct historical evidence that attributes the completion of the Old Testament to Ezra. And I say, really? And so I did this as a test, so I had this all ready to go. I throw him a bunch of very old quotations from older Bible scholars and historians talking about how it was well known throughout the Near East, in Jerusalem, Judea, and even through the Roman Empire, that Ezra had completed the canonization of the Old Testament. And there's a bunch more. These are just some of the Christian scholars that have made these. There's even some older ones that go back to the 1st and 2nd century BC, attributing the canonization of the Bible to Ezra the priest. And yet he wouldn't give me any of that information, and this is what he told me. His answer is very telling. He said, basically, he admitted that these were historical references to the traditional views, but because the modern scholars didn't agree with it, now their position isn't historical anymore, right? You see how dishonest he is? Because modern scholars now disagree with these ancient records and historians. Now these ancient historians, they're no longer historians. Their information is no longer historical sources. They're now historical records of a traditional view, and that's why he didn't give me any of this information. But not only that, I didn't ask him about historical reference. I asked him, did he have any information on Ezra completing the canon of the New Testament? And so he's flat out lying, right? And so this is what we're seeing not only in our institutions of public education, but our internet and now AI has been pre-programmed to give you information that they want you to see. We've seen it on Facebook. We've seen it on social media when it comes to politics. Well, they've been doing it in our institutions for a long time, and now they're doing it with AI and Wikipedia. The bottom line is there's a very real and coordinated attack on the Bible and Christianity that has been going on for centuries. And they've completely infested our libraries, our encyclopedias, Encyclopedia Britannica is no better than this Chat GDP, no better. They've got plenty of the same garbage in there. And this liberal mindset has infested academia. There's very little to no intellectual honesty with them. And we must prepare our young adults and teens to this coordinated attack. There's a great book, if you get a chance to read it. It's called The Icons of Evolution by Jonathan Wells. It's a very well-documented book. It's got like a 70-page bibliography, which is crazy. All the information it has in it, it has documented. And he systematically goes through all of the illustrations that you would typically get in a evolutionary biology college textbook. And he shows conclusively that all of these examples of evolution that they currently teach, they've all been disproven, and many times by other evolutionary biologists, whether referring to the Miller-Ray experiment, Darwin's tree of life, the peppered moss, Haeckel's drawings of embryos, Darwin's finches. All of these explanations of evolution have been fully disproven, but they're still being taught in our universities and colleges today as facts. Well, why? Why are they doing this? Well, why not? They've been lying about every other topic about God and creation. Why not add a few more to the list? One of the illustrations she gives, Jonathan Wells, is that, is with the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC. And one of the jobs of the SEC is to govern stockbrokers and investment brokers. And so let's say I'm an investment broker and I'm doing several things. I'm managing people's financial accounts. I'm updating the accounts of current investors on how their investments are doing. And I'm trying to solicit new accounts to invest in my company, my business, my venture capital firm, whatever. I'm doing some sales work. And I have to report all of this information, everything that I do as an investment broker, to the SEC. The very minute I begin to misrepresent any of my financial information to either my current or new investors, the SEC shows up, they put handcuffs on you, and they haul you off to jail because you're doing a Ponzi scheme. You're lying about how your company's doing. You're moving investment money to try and cover your losses, right? If any of the standards of the SEC were used to regulate professors in our universities who are trying to sell the theory of evolution, they would all be in prison because they're all straight up lying about their information. Another great book on this topic is The Edge of Evolution by Dr. Michael Behe. And he gets into some of the more technical nitty-gritty of biology and evolution and shows pretty conclusively that none of the evolutionary models make any sense. And the mathematical probability of any of it happening through accidental means is absolutely ridiculous. And one of the big examples he gives in his book is that with the antiviral drug for malaria, chloroquine. It began being used in the 1950s. However, by the 1970s, malaria had evolved to become resistant to this drug. Evolutionists touted this evolutionary process as a glaring example of how random mutation has produced a genetic advantage. It had evolved. Well, how did this happen? How did it evolve from this drug working until now it doesn't work anymore? This virus mutated. Well, Michael Behe, in his book, he breaks this down into layman terms. See, in the DNA replication process, once in a while, like once every trillion times, there's an error. And most of the time, that error does nothing. Sometimes the error is so bad that it leads to a termination. But sometimes, like once every trillion times a trillion times, it actually changes the organism to some degree. And in the case of malaria and chloroquine, it took two of these errors, both at the same time, to make it resistant to the drug chloroquine. And what it did exactly was because of the mutation, the malaria virus was allowed to continue to make an amino acid that it wasn't supposed to be making anymore. And it was supposed to stop at a certain juncture for making this one amino acid. But because of this mutation, the switch was flipped from on to off, and it continued to make this amino acid for an indefinite period of time. But once again, the formula for this amino acid was already there. It wasn't created. New genetic code wasn't written. It didn't grow a third eye out of the side of its head. Just there was this switch that told it to stop making this oily amino acid that it was already making, that it already knew how to make. And instead of being switched to the off position, it got switched back on. And as we know, water and oil don't mix. And so it prevented the water base of this chloroquine drug from penetrating its membrane. That's it. That's all that happened. And here's a quote from Michael Behe about the probability of this mutation. On average, for humans to achieve a mutation like this by chance, we would need to wait 100 million times 10 million years. And since that is many times the age of the universe, it's reasonable to conclude the following. No mutation that is of the same complexity as chloroquine resistance in malaria arose by Darwinian evolution in the line leading to humans in the past 10 million years. You know, what Behe here is saying, that you haven't had enough monkeys breeding since the time of the Big Bang to switch one genetic light switch to the on position, let alone let man morph out of this prebiotic soup and transform from bacteria into human. It's a total and complete lie. And once again, we're not talking about a difference of opinion, a different interpretation of the facts, a new perspective. These are just straight up lies by academia. And these are lies against God. And once again, we need to prepare our teens and young adults to beware of these lies as they come forward. Another great book that I would recommend that many of you look at is The Signature in the Cell by Stephen Myers. In his book, he shows how the incredibly complex beginnings of life are, and how the DNA molecule is not just a genetic code, but it's an information storage device, a language. It has vocabulary, it has syntax. And if we have time, I'd like to play a short video on this replication process to illustrate how incredibly complex this DNA replication process is. You might need to adjust the volume on your speakers there, but I'm going to go ahead and play this right now. Can you guys hear it?
No, Joe, we can't hear it.
No, great.
We can see some squiggly stuff, though.
Yeah. Having audio. How about now?
Not yet. Video's coming through good. But...
Oh, okay. Well, that's great. Glad to hear that. Anyway, I'll just, I guess I need to narrate this since apparently this isn't going to come through anytime soon. Basically, the replication process of DNA is incredibly complex, and there's multiple components that are involved in this, multiple mechanisms. You have RNA translations. Much of the system is done in a mechanical means, whereas we see right now, these translators are coming in, and as they fit within the mechanical makeup of the DNA, they are allowed to enter in an amino acid or a protein that fits that description, and that's how they build these amino acids and form protein. And it's a very complex system, and there's multiple components involved, multiple gates, multiple air checking devices involved, multiple processes working together in a very complex manner. And so what it does is it illustrates how absolutely absurd the idea that all of these components were were accidentally assembled at the same time in some prebiotic soup. And what has happened, and this is what academia has done, anytime they have a piece of information that they can't explain, they just don't talk about it anymore. And that's why you rarely have any more discussions on the origins of life, because they've realized that life as we know it is irreducibly complex, and it's not going to happen by some accidental means. And it's insanely retarded to believe that this could have happened through an accidental process. And Steve Myers does a great job of illustrating this. He also shows how the DNA double helix is one of the most compact data storage devices. It is also made up of, like I said, as a language. It's also syntax. It also stores information. And to think that all these items came together at the same time, once again, is insanely retarded. And yet that's what they're teaching in our institutes of higher education. Real quick, how am I doing on time? Does anyone need a coffee break, tea, beer by chance? Anything? It is a camp out, right?
Still has about an hour in this allocation.
I think I'm on 1 hour right now. I could go at least 3 if you give me enough time.
I think you're good, Joe. Everybody's staying put.
Okay, great. Another topic that I'd like to talk about briefly is the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1946, in the caves of Qumran, in the Qumran wilderness, in the West Bank, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And dozens of copies of the Hebrew scriptures were found that dated to the 3rd century and before. And news made headlines. Quickly, teams of archaeologists went to work to try and translate and publish these scrolls because the world was excited to see what they said. Well, as soon as they began to translate and analyze these documents, they also began to delay their release. 40 years later, they still had over half of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were unpublished. They were on over 1,200 photographic plates, over 400 unpublished text. And then by the late 1980s, people began to start to complain, who'd have thunk it? In 1989 and in 1990, Biblical Archaeology Review magazine, BAR magazine, before they went woke, they wrote multiple articles exposing these ridiculous delays in the publishing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were pretty instrumental in getting them published. Even the New York Times, believe it or not, chimed in, and they had an article on entitled "The Vanity of Scholars," where they pointed out that more than 40 years, a cadre of dawdling scholars were still spinning out the work while the world waits and the precious pieces lapse into dust, as they said. Well, so finally, after 40 years, they started receiving a ton of pressure from the media, and all this pressure came from outside academia. Hebrew University finally began to publish the rest of the scrolls, and it only took a few years to do that. I'm assuming somebody threatened to pull their funding. And so why do you think there was a 40-year delay on publishing the Dead Sea Scrolls? Any guesses out there?
Didn't want the truth out.
Exactly. They didn't want the truth out. They didn't want people to know the truth. And I've got a couple of big theories that seem to be very plausible, is that Hebrew University, as well as these other universities that they were connected with doing this research, including Oxford University and others, they at the time were completely infested with these Bible mentalists and critical Bible scholars. And there was an overwhelming consensus amongst these universities that the Bible was inherently flawed. It was full of corruptions. After 35 years of copying the Bible, there were so many mistakes in it, and we have no idea what the original Bible looked like. And so, and that's what Frederick Kenyon, the father of Kathleen Kenyon, believed as well. He wrote multiple books on this topic. This is a quote of his from The Story of the Bible, page 86. In the first place, it is only natural that the Hebrew text should have suffered considerable corruption. And there were many other scholars that were involved in making the case that needed to be revised as well, like Westcott and Hort, which I mentioned earlier, the two occultists. And because of their push to try and get a revised version of the Bible, in 1881, they came up with the revised version, and they made over 30,000 changes to the New Testament alone, because they believed that all these private manuscripts, because they were older, were much more reliable than the manuscripts that were official and were changed through very official rules by scribes and monks. Well, and they had made an entire career on making these changes and making their arguments and getting funding to do the revised version, the English Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Versions. All of this work was based on these the belief that the Masoretic text, the received text, was full of errors. Well, when the Dead Sea Scrolls began to start to be rolled out and it was started to get translated, it was beginning to be discovered that, in fact, the Bible had no corruptions. The Masoretic text was extremely accurate. The only mistakes in it were very minor spelling mistakes. And all of the revisers of 1881, all these guys are completely wrong, right? Well, it doesn't take a rocket surgeon to realize why they released the Dead Sea Scrolls for so long, because then all of these guys over here would have to eat a lot of crow, and all their proteges that they had trained would have to eat a lot of crow. And so they were given a 40-year period of time to reel back the rhetoric and move on to something else, and that's what they did. In my belief, this was a very massive cover-up to try and protect their careers and for their funding. The other major reason for delaying its release, I believe, is because of the book of Daniel. As many as we know, the book of Daniel is the memoirs of a young Jewish man. It was written in the first person by Daniel, who was taken captive during the first incursion of Babylon in 604 BC. There's a lot of information about his personal life there, but there is tons of prophecies in the book of Daniel, very accurate prophecies, prophecies that took place verbatim as the scripture said, right up until the 1st century BC. And so when these minimalist Bible scholars, they're reading history and they're reading the book of Daniel, obviously they're not going to agree that it was written when it said it was written. And so they have consistently attacked the authorship of the book of Daniel, and they have multiple theories, and most all of them say that it was written 400 years after they actually took place, either in the 2nd or 1st century BC, and that Daniel never existed. The whole book's a fraud, but, they don't say it like that. They try and say it more palatable, they try and, because they're trying to sell you their book at the same time. And there's a ton of Bible scholars out there that believe that it was written 400 years after the fact.
Joe, quick question for you.
Go ahead, yeah.
Westcott and Hort, I'd done some research on those back in the 1980s. Is it true in your research that I believe there was 2 main manuscripts that they used quite often? One was called the Sinaiticus,
Yep.
and the other one was called the Vaticanus. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And they're the 2 most popular ones that was supposed to have been the older manuscripts, is what they called them, the older manuscripts. But they end up having a lot of errors in my research. Is that what you
Yes.
also saw?
There was
And that's
a
where a
lot-
lot of these revisions, these like those standard, or those what do you call them, versions that you were just quoting, the standard version and the American standard, mainly were derived from. Is that correct?
They were all derived from the work of Westcott and Hort, and they were one of these revisionists of 1881. They headed the operation. They wrote the lexicon of the New Testament in Greek, and all of these translations were made off of their work. And I'll admit, most of the time, these revisions that they made, because there was 30,000 changes that they made just to the New Testament, about half that many to the Old Testament. And I would say most of the time of those, 45,000 changes, you're not even going to notice it, right? There might be spelling mistakes, there might be the word phrase, but then there's a lot of places where they do make a big difference. I don't have the time right now to do a side-by-side comparison. You can see where they manipulate words and they try and make things confusing. I think their motivation was entirely to try and discredit the Bible, that it needed to be revised, that you couldn't depend on it, that it was full of errors, that, we never know if we're going to finally get the real Bible. There were some areas that they definitely had an agenda for, but most of it, I think, was just to simply discredit the Bible as being authoritative. One of the reasons we know the Bible was given to us by God is how it's undergone such very little changes over the years, and how God's preserved it. It's a witness against us. It's admonition for us. And when they can make you believe that we have no idea what it originally looked like, and this was the work of men that just kept editing it and moving it down the line, I think that was their main goal, is to simply try and make it look like it was just some other document like Shakespeare or Homer's Odyssey. And I think that was their main goal myself.
Another question, Joe.
This is the same gentleman. My name's Randall.
Randall, nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you too.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing, and I'm enjoying what you're saying, especially on these revisions and translations and so on. Shortly after I became born again, back in the 1700s, no, I'm not that old, 1972, it was just within a couple, 2 or 3 years, 4 years, or whatever it was, when I asked the Lord, God, I began to see these other revisions or translations starting to come out a little bit. I don't know if that was too early, but I might be saying this too early after I was born again. But I was in my bedroom praying, and I had, the King James was very popular, obviously, in most people's hands back in that time. And so I began to ask the Lord, I said, Lord, what about these other translations? Have I got the right Bible? And I hadn't done any studying on what we're talking about. And I'm not saying this is Lord, and I'm not saying it wasn't the Lord that said this to me, but I heard this in my heart or mind. It came to me this way. It says, because Satan realized that he could not destroy the Bible or the true Word of God, so he decided to, I'm going to have to say it the way it came to me, he decided, well, since I can't get rid of the Bible, then I will give the people a Bible that is not providentially preserved. In other words, it's not, I know some people may not like that, but that's the way it came to me, that these other translations had a satanic plot to it, to deter from the true Masoretic or the received text, to pull people away. And I think I remember doing a lot of comparisons now, long story short, where there was the Westcott and Hort's revisions that they did attacked a lot of different subjects of the Bible, the deity, and the blood and things like that. But that was amazing. I was only just a young Christian, and I asked God about that, and that's all I heard. I'm not saying it was of the Lord, or I'm not saying it wasn't, but it seemed like he said, I will give a what do you call it? Not a counterfeit per se, but a duplicate. You know, you mix truth and error is the way you deceive people. And that's kind of what came to me in my 20s. So I don't know if you agree with to a great degree on that or not. Thank you, sir.
Oh, definitely. So Westcott and Hort, who headed the project of the revisers of 1881, they were involved in the occult. And one of the things they were doing is they call it the communion of the saints, is the political way of saying it. But in reality, they were just channeling demons. And Westcott would go to these cathedrals alone by himself. And in a very short period of time, he would have a large number of these demons that he was, I should probably turn these ringers off. He would be channeling with and getting information from them. And so it's very realistic to believe that he was getting this information from those demons that he was speaking to. And so you're not far from the truth at all there. Right? It's been fairly well documented what these guys were into. They were channeling with demons. They were involved with the occult. Any other questions before we move forward?
Looks like we're good, Joe.
Okay.
Back to the
All right.
Book of Daniel.
So we were talking about the Book of Daniel and how it has been highly attacked by these revisionists and Bible minimalists. And I'd like to read some of these quotes, and many of these, and just to give you a quick reference here, if you're ever at a bookstore and you're considering buying a Bible handbook or a commentary or some kind of a Bible help, a quick litmus test, if you're trying to figure out, okay, is this commentary a liberal commentary? Is it a conservative one? Just go and read what it says about the Book of Daniel. And if they're a Bible minimalist or they don't believe in the authority of the Bible, they're going to tell you right now, oh, it was written around the 2nd or 1st century BC. They cannot admit that it was written when it was written. And so we're going to read some of these quotes, and you're going to see pretty, they try and soft pedal it to you. They try and make it very palatable, but at the end of the day, they do not believe in the authority of the Bible, and they do not believe that Daniel could have made these predictions. Oxford Bible Commentary. Oxford seems to be the epicenter of most of the Bible minimalists and scholars. Most scholars believe the Book of Daniel originated during the Hellenistic period, although it purports to be a product of the Babylonian exile. Harper's Bible Commentary. Most scholars date the Book of Daniel to the 2nd century BC, much later than the 6th century Babylonian exile. James Hamastra from Andrews University. Many hold a late date for the Book of Daniel, which pushes the date of its completion as far back as the first half of the 1st century BC. And Expositor's Bible Commentary. I mean, this one's great. I mean, you really got to put your hip waders on and pull them up really high for this guy. And get this, they state a growing number of scholars have really come to appreciate the testimony that the book itself represents, at least in part, the product of the Maccabean period, especially a period of severe persecution pressing upon the Jewish community from 168 to 164 BC. And this is a classic example of spin, where you're talking about something that's actually bad, but you spin it around to make it sound kind of good. It's actually a good thing, like women's reproductive freedom or gender affirming healthcare. These are positive things, right? Well, Expositor's claims, a growing number of scholars think the book is really great, and they've really come to appreciate it, even though it's a complete fraud. It was written 400 years after the book claims. We don't even know if Daniel existed. None of it's historically accurate, but totally read it because it's great for your spiritual growth. Well, this is a total joke what they're saying. And of course, Wikipedia, they're one of the worst. This is what they say. The most probable conclusion is the account must have been completed near the end of the reign of Antiochus, but before his death in December of 164 BC, or before the news reached Jerusalem. And the consensus of modern scholar accordingly dates it to this period of time. Once again, 400 years after the fact. And so, once again, why have they consistently attacked the book of Daniel? Well, it's because of its incredibly accurate prophecies. The book of Daniel predicts the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire in order. It gives descriptions on how those empires were structured. It gives specific details about Persian kings, their empire and structure, Alexander the Great, his fighting style, the king of the north, king of the south. There's very intricate prophecies in that period of time. And the one of the big things is that exactly 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices later, after the abomination of desolation by Antiochus Epiphanes, the temple was cleansed. The book also gives details about the Roman Empire, how it would be divided into two kingdoms, and how it would later persecute Christians. And that's in Daniel 7:25. You've got the 70 weeks prophecy. It gives very specific details of how you can calculate the coming of the Messiah. Yeah. And all of this easily fits into the period of time when Christ was born. But most of all, Daniel is one of the most quoted books in the New Testament. He's quoted and referred to as a prophet by Jesus Christ. And if you can prove that Daniel is a fraud, then pretty much all the Bible is a fraud. And Christianity is you guys are a bunch of jokers, right? And if any liberal scholar from Expositor's Bible Commentary tries to tell you that even though the book of Daniel wasn't written by Daniel, it was actually written 400 years after the fact by some con artist who apparently fooled Jesus Christ, he fooled the apostles, all the early church, but none of this should undermine your faith. Well, this is ridiculous, but that's what they try and say. See, the truth is, if they told you what they really believe, that they're atheists and they will not believe in predictive prophecy, and that's the number one reason why they won't accept the dating. Well, if they told you that, then you wouldn't send your kids to their university. You wouldn't read their books. You definitely wouldn't buy their books, and you would take their opinion with a grain of salt. So instead of telling you the truth, they revert to all these lies and misdirection and excuses. We're just these unbiased seekers of truth, and we're just following the truth wherever it takes me, right? And the primary explanation, if you read into any of these commentaries and biblical handbooks, they try and tell you why Daniel was written over 400 years after the fact, is once again through this illusion of consensus. All of these Bible commentaries here, they all say most scholars, all scholars, most scholars hold to a late date. A growing number of scholars. There's this illusion of consensus. And it's once again, it's not true. It's an illusion, but it's not there. And we could go through a bunch of this research on what they say. They give a number of reasons why. The Encyclopedia Britannica is a great example, because they actually list all the reasons why they hold a late date to the book of Daniel. And all of them, it's a load of garbage. You go through each one of them, and this is ridiculous. Where in conversely, the reality of it is that all of the linguistic evidence, all of the dating of the type of Aramaic that was used, all of it points towards the 8th, the 7th, and the 6th century BC, not anywhere close to the 2nd century BC. And so I could spend an hour on this topic, but it's a ton of lies. Every example they give. One of the examples that is very interesting is the fact that the book of Daniel is completely devoid of Greek. Okay, there is very little to any Greek in the book of Daniel. You know, English itself, I think a third of English has loan words from Latin. A third of our English language, although it's a Germanic language, which is very close to Assyrian, which is a different topic. But a third of our English language is borrowed from Latin, and another like 25% comes from Greek, because those were predominant empires that conquered everyone, and as they're the predominant lingua franca, right, the international language, you end up pulling all these words into your vocabulary. Well, the book of Daniel is completely devoid of Greek words. And not only that, the book of Daniel, the etymology and the vocabulary very closely matches the Aramaic used during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And not only that, there's a ton of Persian loan words in the book of Daniel. If you want to turn real quickly, we could turn there to the book of Daniel, chapter 1 and verse 8. And I can't find my slide for that. Hold on. Yeah, I lost my slide. But if anybody's got a Bible there, if we turn over to the...
Everybody has Bibles here, Joe. Everybody's
Awesome.
turning right
Great.
now. Yeah.
I can't see anybody, so let's turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. And let's pick it up in verse 3. And the king spoke to Aspenaz, the master of his officers, that he should bring some of the children of Israel and the king's seeds and the nobles. Well, up until the late, I say middle 20th century, everybody thought this word here, Aspenaz, was actually was the proper name for this master, this chief of Nebuchadnezzar's officers. But in reality, this Aspenaz is actually a Persian word. It's an old Persian word, and it means innkeeper. And until they dug up clay tablets and they started translating them, did they finally realize that this word Aspenaz is actually a Persian word. Well, once again, if the book of Daniel was written in the first century BC, why couldn't anybody translate this? Why didn't they know Old Persian? Also, the Septuagint was also translated during this same period of time. The Septuagint translation of the Greek also took place during the 2nd century BC, with only a matter of years from the time that Daniel was written. It also translates Ashpenaz as a personal name, capitalized like it is here, not as an innkeeper, because the 70 translators, even though they knew Greek very well, they didn't know Old Persian. Old Persian was a dead language by this time, and they had no idea how to translate this word, and they assumed it was a personal name. And there's like 14 different Persian words in the Aramaic section. I think there's another 4 or 5 in the Hebrew section, showing that it was written during that period of time, not in the 2nd century BC. And so as we go through the book of Daniel, I don't have the time for it, but it is overwhelmingly obvious that this was written during the time period. And all of the information, if you look on Wikipedia, they tell you, according to the etymology, the linguistic evidence, that it was actually written during the 2nd century BC. That is it's a straight up lie. There's really no proof to that whatsoever. They're simply making it up. And the reason they picked that date is it was the last possible date that they could come up with, and still dismiss all the happenings of chapter 11 with the king of the north and the king of the south. And once again, the point I'm getting back to is that our institutes of higher education, Bible scholars, they are consistently attacking Christianity every step of the way. every time they get an opportunity to. And we have to train our young people, our young adults, our teenagers to be aware of this before they go off into our institutes of higher education. You know, as Christians, generally speaking, we are to assume the best of others. We're to esteem others better than ourselves. We're to give other people the benefit of the doubt. And these are great principles that we should all practice and do our best to adhere to on a daily basis. However, there's also plenty of examples in Scripture for a strong rebuke. Christ gave a strong rebuke towards the scribes and Pharisees, Peter towards Simon Magus, Jude towards pretty much everybody, the ungodly, and academia and our institutes of higher education 100% deserve this level of rebuke. They've become infested with ungodly men who have a very specific agenda to try and destroy Christianity, to destroy the family, to destroy our nation. And all of this began with lies against God. That is the common denominator. Just a quick notation. If you look at the Democrat Party, for instance, and who they like to cozy up to, you know, the LGBT gay community, the trans community, the feminists, pro-abortion, and also the other community that they want to cozy up to is Islam. And you're wondering yourself, that's a very odd motley crew of people together, right? Because if you did any of those things in, if you did any of those things in any of the Islamic countries, they would stone you, behead you, have you run out of town. So why Islam? Well, the only common denominator between all of these special interest groups in Islam is they are all anti-Christian. That's the common denominator there. And that level of coordination only comes through Satan the devil. He is involved behind this. We know he's a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And we have to realize that our universities have become completely infested with this demonic influence. And those that aren't involved in it, many of the remaining faculty, they're cowards. They're too afraid to say anything. Their first loyalty is to their paycheck and their pensions, and so they remain silent. And they just kind of go along with it quietly. Cancel culture is very strong at these universities. It's been very well documented. There's been a lot of documentaries on this topic. Stephen Myers, he was at I believe the University of Seattle at the time when he published his book, and they ran him out of town. They pulled his funding. They threatened his job because he wouldn't support the dialogue of evolution. And we need to prepare our young adults before they head out to these universities and get blinded with this demonic rhetoric. There is a bias, there is an agenda, and there is no intellectual honesty amongst them. And their main agenda is to attack God. And once again, there's no way that you could have such a coordinated attack without demonic forces being at play. Over in Revelation 12, verse 9, a very familiar scripture, it says, the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. And I like the Faithful Version translation a little bit better here, because it says the great dragon was cast out, the serpent who is called the devil and Satan, who is deceiving the whole world. It's in the present progressive sense. And the implication is Satan has always deceived individuals, and he's always been the liar and the father of it. But at the time of the end, his deceptions will have culminated to a level never seen before. At the time of the end, he will practically be deceiving the entire world. At the time of the end, the deceptions of Satan will be at its fullest, and we should expect it. We need to know that he is a roaring lion. He is seeking whom he may desire. His primary tool, I believe, is in our colleges and universities. And as we draw nearer and nearer to the time of the end, we should only expect more of these deceptions and for them to get worse. If you look at the Olivet prophecy in Matthew 24, look at how many times the word deceive is used in there. It's all over the place, and it's used to characterize the end times. And that is where we're at. We must watch and pray always, and we must prepare our children and be ready for the greatest time of deception that this world has ever seen. Once again, if anybody's got any questions, I'd love to talk about it. I've got a lot more information, but I think we're about run out of steam here.
Thank you very much.
All right, Joe, I'm not seeing any questions. Got one.
Here you go. Joe, I've got a question for you. And I know you've talked a lot about those sources that were corrupted, or the Oxford, let's see, some of them you mentioned were the Oxford Bible Commentary and Expositor's Bible Commentary. And I know that, but you also have sources that you're using for explaining how Daniel was written correctly in the time period that it was written. And what were those sources that you were using? Like, what was, I guess, my question is, are there some conservative commentaries that you're trusting to whenever you look at some of those sources, where you find that describe the correct, that it is, Daniel was correctly written in a time period that it was?
Most of the information I got from Andrews University, and the Seventh-day Adventists have done a lot to expose this issue. Because what has happened is most of these commentaries, they just don't talk about it anymore. You know, and that's the typical fashion, is when you have an issue that you can't really address anymore, and you can't find a way to spin it, and you can't find a way to accept it. You know, it's kind of like the Bud Light controversy. Now they're stuck in the middle. They can't be for it or against it, or they'll lose drinkers on both sides. So they just don't talk about it anymore. They remain silent. I've pretty much given up. I haven't bought any newer commentaries in quite some time. I end up doing my own research. But most everything, and I can give you guys sources for it, it's coming from Andrews University. They've done a lot of work and a lot of research the Seventh-day Adventists have on this topic. And a lot of it, and they picked apart the etymology of the Daniel. And there's a lot of historical information that backs up the book of Daniel. If you guys want some time, I can go another 15 minutes on this topic if you're interested.
I guess, and we've got another question, Joe, about the Matthew Henry's commentary, which I know I have a copy of that actually, also, that I use some, and I know it was written back 400 years or so ago. You have any thoughts about the Matthew Henry commentary?
I've used Matthew Henry. He typically doesn't get too involved in a lot of the stuff. I take that back. I use I got a whole stack of them right in the other room. I can't see them right now, but Haley's Bible Handbook is actually pretty good. I've used that one quite a bit. There's a Barclay's is pretty good, but he's only New Testament. He mainly deals with doesn't really get into archaeology or any of the older disciplines, because it's the New Testament. That I use Matthew Henry's commentary, but I typically got 5 or 6 open at the same time, and I'm comparing them all. And so some of these Bible commentaries are great, and some of them aren't so good. But I know expositors and the Encyclopedia Britannica is a great source. But once again, it's written in 1911, and it's pre the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so they have a bunch of the information in there about the inaccuracy of the Bible. They were influenced by modern scholarship, mainly at the turn of the century. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of just bad sources out there if you get into the nuts and bolts of the book of Daniel. Like I said, most everything I've found has come from the Seventh-day Adventists and Andrews University.
Yeah, I agree exactly with what you've been telling us about about Daniel. You know, that it was written when the Bible says it was written. Yeah, I agree with that completely. I appreciate the comments.
If we want to talk a little bit more about the book of Daniel, we can. I've got some really good quotes here from about this topic. One of them is from Dr. Robert Wilson. He's a linguistic and Old Testament scholar. And he says this in International Bible Encyclopedia. There's a good one for you. The Aramaic in Daniel is almost exactly the same, which is found in portions of Ezra, on the account of the large number of Babylonian Persian words characteristic of this Aramaic and of that of the papyri we recently found in Egypt, as well as on account of the general similarity of the nominal, verbal, and other forms of syntactical construction, and the Aramaic of this period of time might be called the Babylonian Persian Aramaic. And see, during the 19th century, they found a treasure trove of papyri documents were found on Elephant Island. It was around, there was a Jewish temple there, and it was found in the Delta region of Egypt. And they found thousands and thousands of documents there from the Jews, and they excavated this over a 70-year period of time, and they dated all of it to the 5th and 6th centuries, around the same time as Daniel. And the majority of it was written in Aramaic, which was the international language at the time. And the Aramaic of that period of time matches perfectly with the book of Daniel. You have an absence of Persian, or absence of Greek words, and you have lots of Persian and Babylonian words mixed in with it. Wilson continues, he's got some more good quotes here. The composite of Aramaic of Daniel agrees in almost every particular orthology, etymology, syntax with the Aramaic of the North Semitic inscriptions of the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BC, and the Egyptian papyri of the 5th century BC. And the vocabulary of Daniel is an admixture of Hebrew, Persian, and Babylonian words similar to the papyri of the 5th century. And, you know, once again, there's no indication that you could just walk down to your local Barnes and Nobles in 167 BC, you know, grab a bunch of books from the dead language section and put it together to try and promote your religious devotion, you know. But, you know, that's what they're proposing. And that's the only thing they have to go with. And the question comes up, well, if you were able to just go down to the library and grab all these books to educate yourself on Persian Aramaic, well, why couldn't the writers of the Septuagint do the same? Because there we can definitely see the difference in the language. And the other question comes up with, well, if they all date, these same scholars have no problem dating Ezra to the 5th century BC and these other papyri to the 6th century BC, well, the Aramaic's the same. So, and the Hebrew is the same. Why is it that they won't attribute Daniel? Well, it's because they won't believe in predictive prophecy. And that's where it all comes down to. They will not believe in predictive prophecy. But once again, they won't say that because then you wouldn't buy their books. You wouldn't send your kids to the colleges. You know, it would be horrible for their funding, you know. And there's a bunch of historical information as well in the book of Daniel. For instance, if we look at the different structures of government, for instance, Nebuchadnezzar, he was an absolute monarch, right? And he could do whatever he wanted to. But then when you come to the Persians, you know, Darius the Mede, he had a constitutional monarchy. He had to get permission. He had to get the law of the Medes and Persians changed before he could throw somebody in the lion's den, you know. And so there was a different governmental structure, and all that matches, of course, completely of what we find in history. Also over in Daniel chapter 5 or 7, we could turn there real quick. This is another great example of the historical accuracy of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 7. The king cried to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans and astrologers. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and declare to me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple and have a gold chain about his neck, and he shall be called the third ruler in the kingdom, right? Well, for centuries, Bible critics claimed Belshazzar was a fictitious invention of the book of Daniel. There's no record of him as king. Well, in 1854, references to Belshazzar started being picked up in cuneiform tablets and was later confirmed in 1881 with the Nibonius cylinder. And I think I have a picture of that here, actually. Yeah, there we go. The Nibonius cylinder, that his father, Nibonius, was actually a co-regent with Belshazzar in Babylon. And it also showed that he was frequently out of the kingdom, right? And that he, I believe, had health problems, and he went off to this other location. I can't remember the name of it quite often. And or to Tamra, that's the where he would go all the time, was to Tamra. And well, not only it showed a couple of things. One thing, it showed that Belshazzar was the second in the kingdom, and that's the reason he can only offer to Daniel to be the third ruler in the kingdom. And it also showed that his father Nibonius was away quite often, and that's why the book of Daniel frequently talks about Belshazzar being in charge at the time, because he was. Another thing that's interesting is that in Daniel 8 verse 20, you want to turn over there real quick.
Hey, Joe, we've got a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
It's your good friend Randall again.
Oh, okay.
In the book of Daniel, was there one particular prophecy that they wanted to throw the whole book of Daniel out as fictitious, or was it a combination of several prophecies? I was thinking if it was just one, I'm just wondering if it was the 70 weeks.
That's a big one, yep.
Was that the big one?
Prophecy is a huge one. The other one is I can't remember the period of time that it was, but it was a 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices.
Right.
Because they have information to show that it was just about that amount of time, 1,500 days from the time that the abomination desolation took place till the time they were able to sanctify the temple again. And so it was about that 1,500 day period of time. And so that was another big problem with them. That's why they wouldn't accept that either. The problem is that there is, and it's a very interesting study. Andrews University, once again, has got a lot of information on it, of all of the messianic prophecies and all the discussion and all the chatter amongst the Jews talking about that period between 4 and 7 BC, when there was a messianic expectation. They expected him to show up at about that time. And so that's one of the problems. But those documents came up a little bit later. And then after they started to find those documents, they're like, okay, what do we do with this? Because they couldn't even dismiss that now. You know?
Question?
And so that's that. I would say that it was first the messianic prophecies of the 70 weeks, and then I would say number 2 would be that. But then all the king of the north, king of south. I mean, that's a very detailed description of wars between the Seleucid dynasty, Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties, where they fought back and forth and all their intermarrying, and that was another huge one. So there's just too many prophecies. There's also Alexander the Great. You know, he had no posterity, but his empire was split into 4 sections to 4 winds. We know that happened exactly. Another very interesting one was Alexander the Great's fighting style. Now, what Alexander the Great did is he had a what they called was the Macedonian phalanx. Somebody want to pronounce that for me? But anyway, at the time, most of the soldiers used a short sword and maybe a spear and a shield. That was the three. Well, what Alexander the Great's father did was is he came up with this fighting style with these poles that were like 20 feet long, and you got 5 rows of soldiers all lined up like this, and they would basically, if you wanted to advance, you had to fight your way through 5 layers of spears on this 20-foot pole, you know, and it just made advancing impossible. It wasn't until the Roman legions were they able to find a way to work their way in to these into these spears. Well, it's described, that fighting style is described in Daniel chapter 8. If we want to look there real quick, you can see where the you got the 2 goats, the goats and the ram, and the goat came after him and just charged him. His feet didn't touch the ground. And that was the fighting style. And the other thing, he was by the banks of the river. Alexander the Great always stuck to the banks of the river, and that's how he was able to prevent the chariots from coming in. And when you read Daniel chapter 8, you see Alexander the Great's fighting style everywhere in there. And so the book of Daniel is very unique in the way that it's has all these little specific details, and because these prophecies have already taken place.
Got one more question.
Go ahead.
Okay. In chapter 9, I believe, is the 70 weeks prophecy. I just want to get your take on this, because I'd studied the 70 weeks several times, but a long time ago initially. The figuring of the time of the going forth of the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem was the starting time, I believe, of the 70 weeks, which we know a day's a year. So you got 490 years from 457 or somewhere around there. And I just want to get your take. I think everybody that studied that agrees that the first 69 weeks takes you up, which is 483 years, would take you up to the baptism of Jesus. Do you agree on that part? Not?
From what I've studied, the 70 weeks prophecy points to his the beginning of his ministry, and if you would assume that would be at the time of his baptism, then that would be correct. That's what I would concur with.
Because here's the thing, I hear both sides. If 69 weeks are consecutive, there's a teaching out there that the 70th week, they put a 2,000 plus year gap down to a 7-year tribulation period, which you've heard of that. But it's hard for me to swallow that because in the midst of the 70th week, which would be 3.5 years, which seems to coincide with the sacrifice of Jesus. If you're reading Daniel 9:24 through 27, and that 70th week is still regarding the Jews. And so I don't know, I just get your take on that. You probably have heard the teaching of the 70th week is moved down here to the end time. And can't see that if you got 69 consecutive, one right after the other. What gives credence to move the 70th week down to the end? You understand?
I don't agree with that. So the way I read the 70 weeks prophecy, it says he was cut off in the middle of the week. Right. And so that's where you get the extra 3.5 years. He had a 3.5 year ministry. I'm going to go there real quick.
And I think he had 3. It was to the Jewish people, and when Jesus did his sacrifice, there was still another 3.5 years to confirm that new covenant. And is that understanding correctly?
No, I think he confirmed the covenant. Let's read it. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and offering to cease. Mm-hmm. And upon the wings of the abomination will come who makes desolate. Okay, that's a forward prophecy. But in Daniel 9, it says, after 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off. Okay, and as far as I know, if you've got 62 and 7, and he's getting cut off in the midst of the week, that's going to be, 3.5 years.
Yeah.
Now, you see on the chart that I have up there, and I believe this was done by the Seventh-day Adventists, is where this came from. They show a 7-week period at the end times, and I don't necessarily confer with that.
Okay. Thank you.
I-
Thank you.
And then one more question, Joe. We've got a gentleman wanting to know what Bible version you would recommend.
I use the Faithful Version. The author of it is Fred Coulter and Michael Heiss. I've met both of these gentlemen in the past, and they're God-fearing men. They keep the seventh-day Sabbath. They keep the holy days, and they seem very honest. The one criticism I've heard is a lot of these Bible translations have big teams where they debate over the words. And so here you got two guys, because Fred did the New Testament, Michael did the Old Testament. It's kind of a one-man show. But to their defense, I would say that because there are so many translations out there and you can compare different versions, and, Fred uses the received text. It's all the Masoretic text that he uses, and he always favors the King James Version, and it's only in places where he's clarifying. So if you read his next to the King James Version, it's reading very similar to that in the New King James, and then there are places where he makes corrections. A lot of it has to do with the definite article, and especially when we come to talking about the law, the definite article comes in and just correcting various mistakes that have been made that we all know are there, and he fixes them all. So I personally recommend I use the New King James and I use the Faithful Version side by side is what I typically do.
Hey, Joe, this is your good friend again, Randall. One of the things that I used, I like the King James Version. I don't know, I haven't found another version that correctly translates Matthew 28:1 correctly. Book of Matthew, when it regards the resurrection in the King James Version, gives you a Sabbath visit to the tomb. Whereas these other versions are always, even Matthew on the other versions are giving you, after the Sabbath came the ladies. And Matthew 28:1 in the literal Greek to English, which I have that Greek linear, it says, now late on Sabbath, as it began to grow dusk, towards. Now, towards is a very key word, meaning you're not yet at Sunday. As you're going towards something, you're not there yet. So that's why I like the King James Version as far as proving the day that we believe that Jesus rose on late on the Sabbath day before it ended.
Okay, well, here's the Faithful Version. It says, now late on the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was drawing near, right? Yeah. Mary Magdalene and the others came to observe the sepulcher. So.
Thank you, sir.
All right, Joe. A lot of great
Yeah,
people
well, I'm
here.
running out of time. I think you guys got somebody else coming up after me, correct?
Yeah. You're a little bit over time, Joe.
Byron, where do you get that version from?
Well, thank you very much for listening to me ramble on for
Hey,
2 hours.
Joe, would you pray us out?
Oh, yeah, please. Oh, yeah, of course. Eternal Father in heaven, we come before your throne. We give you thanks for all the many truths that you've given us, that you've revealed us through your Holy Spirit and through your word, and for those who have taught all of us over the years. And we ask you, please continue to watch over us and pray everyone in their travels home, and pray that we continually are receptive to your word and we allow ourselves to be led by your Spirit. And we just ask you to continually help us to remain humble and teachable in all that we do. We give you thanks for all this in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen.
All right. Thanks, Joe. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Hope to be there in person next year.